podcast with me, Liz Worthen, where we talk about all things sustainability. And today I'm really pleased to be welcoming back Benedicte Yue, Chief Financial Officer at River Learning Trust, ISBL Fellow, and sector leader and champion for change. One of the things, Benedicte, you spoke about when last on the podcast was your passion for inclusion. And today we're linking into that and we're delving into quite a challenging issue, SEND funding, high needs funding in particular. So for those who don't live and breathe the intricacies of SEND funding, let's start. Tell us a little bit about what high needs funding is, and more importantly, why is it so problematic for schools at the moment?
Good morning, Liz, and I'm very pleased to be back on your podcast for combining my passion for inclusion with my finance expertise. So about 1.8 million children with special needs in England. About 1.3 are receiving SEND support, and about 500,000 are on education, health, and care plan. So demand has increased significantly over the last 10 years. This trend is mirrored internationally. The growth is less driven by physical disabilities and more by autism, by speech and language communication needs, social and emotional and mental health needs like ADHD. So in England, the pressure is particularly acute for those requiring statutory support. And the number of EHCP has increased by 140% over the last decade, and the funding has doubled, reaching 12 billion in 25-26. So if I start with the first part of your question, what is high needs funding? So in mainstream schools, you've got three main components of funding. You've got the core funding, the per pupil funding that school receive to cover the standard cost of education. And then you've got the notional SEND. So you often hear about the 6,000 threshold. So schools are expected to provide the first 6,000 of additional support from their core funding. So this is not ring fence. This is calculated using proxies such as prior attainment or deprivation. On average, Haskell did a survey, and it's about 11% of the school core funding. The issue is that this was set up in 2013, and when the average ESCP ratio was at about 2.5%. And when staff costs were much lower. So today it's representing much less than it used to represent a while ago. And then the third element is what we call the element 3, the top-up funding. It is funded from the local authority high needs block for pupils whose needs exceed the 6,000 threshold. So what are the issues? How can we summarize the issues with the current model? So despite record investment, I said 12 billion doubling as a funding doubling over that period, the system is financially unsustainable. The cumulative high needs block deficit is approximately 5 billion and is projected to grow quite significantly. So half of the councils report that they could face insolvency within 3 years if the statutory override, so it's a mechanism that keeps their deficit off their balance sheet. If this mechanism is removed in March 28, a lot of them could be bankrupt. So the second big problem, so not only is it unsustainable, but it's not delivering results. So the outcomes are stagnating. So we can see the disadvantage gap is nearly 2 years now. It has widened post-pandemic. It's nearly 2 years by key stage 4 for people with SEND. The people with SEND are twice as likely to be persistently absent. They are 5 times more likely to be permanently excluded, and the progression to employment it remains very poor. So not sustainable despite lots of investment, outcomes stagnating. And the third issue is that as well as the needs and the demand has risen, the local services have been cut. So in Oxfordshire, for example, local government funding has fallen by 57% over 10 years. So this reduction in specialist resources has compromised the quality of the provision. Therefore, the system is completely overwhelmed by reactive, bureaucratic, and diagnostic-driven process, largely due to the over-reliance on the EHCP, which is perceived as the only gateway to funding. So this has therefore created this very reactive bureaucratic model and has completely saturated the system, as well as being very costly and does not even guarantee good outcomes. So a policy consultant, David Thomas, for example, estimated that just the cost of processing the HCPs is about 500 million. So imagine if we were to release that money to the front line. So therefore, frustrated parents often resort to tribunals, which increases litigation cost and privileges the families able to navigate the system. So it's not very equitable. And finally, the over-reliance on special schools rather than being within mainstream has created overcrowded special schools due to a lack of probably planning in state special schools and an over-reliance on independent special schools. In Oxfordshire, for example, a third of the INES block is spent on the independent provision and transport cost as well, because often these provisions are outside county. So the fundamental issue is really misaligned incentives when attracting the funding when inclusion phase and penalizing schools when it succeeds. Here we are for your first question, Alice. I hope that helps.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Benedict, for summarizing so much of that. And I still find it so interesting and saddening. I remember when the new legislation came in 2014, we were doing a lot of work on what does this mean. And, none of this was intended. Changes introduced with good rationale, but yes, it has, and probably other things too, have just, as you say, resulted in a system that isn't sustainable and with all these incentives, misaligned incentives that are not working. So, because I feel like it's easy to lose track of these things, we're speaking at the beginning of January. And so, where are we at in terms of the government plans at the moment? Because there is talk of a white paper, isn't there? There's talk of reform, and I think there's a recognition that reform is needed, but we're not quite sure when or what. Is that right?
Yeah, we're all waiting for that.
Yeah.
Since I've done my role at River Learning Trust since 2019, successive governments have undertaken numerous initiatives to address the SEN crisis. So the SEN review was initiated in 2019 before the pandemic. It led to the publication of a report called Right Support, Right Place, Right Time, and a green paper in March 22. So this was followed by the SEN Alternative Provision Implementation Plan in March 23. And then since July 24, when we had the new Labour government, they have continued these reforms, emphasizing on early identification, on mainstream inclusivity and professional development. So there have also been changes in education policy, in the curriculum review, not going far enough in my view, and on accountability, with Ofsted now putting more emphasis on inclusion. But on the financial side, these strategic frameworks have been supported by significant additional investment and targeted interventions, particularly in those local authorities with the largest deficits. So programs like the safety valves or delivering better value were introduced to support local authorities with huge deficits. And now the safety valve arrangement have been paused. But there has also been a push for banding and tariffs in SEN funding, aiming for greater consistency, but without clear evidence to support this approach. And the statutory override, as I said earlier, has been extended to 28, but it offers just a short-term relief rather than offering a solution. And finally, substantial capital investment have been provided to expand the capacity of special schools, create more places, but more special provision is certainly needed, but it's not a solution alone, because the places would fill very quickly with very limited impact on numbers. So overall, very positive steps, but too slow, lack of coherent strategy. So often these initiatives are a bit piecemeal, and it leads to a very fragmented approach with limited evidence that the measures proposed are addressing the financial sustainability and not really tackling the drivers of cost and demand. So a lot of the money as well is locked in meeting the statutory requirements, with little support for early intervention and inclusion in mainstream. And many initiatives perpetuate what we call the deficit model, where the funding is often tied to diagnosis rather than proactive intervention. So all the eyes, as you said, are now on the upcoming school white paper to really transform this in concrete reforms. And the concerns there are concerns about further delays in those policy announcements, because even if we have a white paper, there will be further consultation, and the absence of a concrete practical proposal is an issue for families, given the crisis we are in at the moment. So that's where we are with the government plans at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. And like, look, families and parents are very worried, aren't they? They're worried about the prospect of perhaps they feel there won't be the same support, but at the same time, as you said, we have a system which is unsustainable with local authorities could be insolvent, going bankrupt because of the pressures. So it's tough, isn't it? But let's say yes, this is a time, hopefully, an opportunity for positive change. But what would you see as well? You talk about, say, for example, the fragmented approach, the money that's then locked into statutory support. What else would you see as some of the main barriers to creating a truly inclusive education system, which is fair, efficient, and also financially sustainable?
So yeah, I mentioned earlier some of the barriers in the funding system due to the misaligned incentives, the sustained underinvestment leading to support being cut. There is also an important issue of equity in the allocation of the needs block. It's still very much based on historical factors. I think about 40% if I'm right. So that means that the more you spend, the more local authorities are getting. So it's therefore penalizing in a way those local authorities implementing reforms. There is also an equity in accessing the provision when you have similar needs. So the current system is favoring those who are better able to navigate the system, as well as some schools seem to be able to seems to take more than their fair share. Some we call them magnet schools sometimes. But it's also important to look at why the barriers to inclusion in England to answer your question. So it has been consistently difficult to meet the needs of all pupils due to a lot of structural, political, and cultural factors. First of all, I think there has been for a long time negative attitude and stereotypes or misconceptions about diversity, a lack of belief perhaps of that is possible and desirable to educate all children together, leading to low expectations from teachers and communities. Additionally, I think for a long time, SEN was viewed as the responsibility of specialists like teaching assistant, often positioned separately from core teaching with insufficient teacher training as well. So, for example, in a survey, half of the teachers felt unprepared to support these pupils. In England, there is a very fragmented and segregated education system. You are labeling people. You don't behave, you go there. You've got this problem, you go there, etc. It's still very segregated, lacks coherence and coordination that prevents effective cooperation and often leads to confusion for families as well as increased cost. Under the last conservative government, we also had a competitive approach to policy. So on three grounds, particularly on admissions rules, for example, I like Jeff Barton's quote. He said once that when you send a kid in a taxi to go elsewhere, it's not inclusion. Autonomy is not autonomy of shouldn't be autonomy of which people you admit. And so admission is something that needs to be looked at. On accountability, I think a teacher's success and school league tables are often tied up primarily to academic attainment metrics, which can create a disincentive for schools to actively include or retain a high number of pupils with complex needs. And this may negatively affect their performance measures. So yes, there is a disincentive around accountability. And also, finally, the curriculum is very much I think there is a curriculum review coming up, but is very much focused on standardized testing and often inflexible, failing to accommodate the diverse needs, the diverse learning styles, and marginalized students. There is also a lack of vocational pathways. The education system maintains that hierarchy, which has consistently privileged academic routes over technical and vocational qualifications, making it harder to serve pupils with non-academic aspirations.
Enjoying the podcast? Hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. It will help other educators discover us too. Now back to the show.
Since the pandemic, we've also seen an increase in child poverty, which has led to the disengagement of some or limiting their opportunities. And perhaps as well, finally, some historical barriers with the legacy of the empire. The curriculum sometimes fails to represent students from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And there is that sense of irrelevance, perhaps, for them to fully engage in the curriculum if they don't feel represented. Yeah, we've shifted probably from educating a small part of the population to mass education, and it came with its challenges. But now you've got nearly half of the pupils with some label of SEND at some point in their education. So we can't really talk about special, and the system really needs to adapt to that diversity.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's so interesting. I was having a conversation with someone recently who was talking about the young people in their school wanting something that feels more relevant. And actually, the young people really feeling quite disconnected from what's on offer at school and wanting more of that sense of belonging, or this is something that means something to us. And again, one of the things I think I find so surprising is how we've moved away from inclusion. Because again, 2014, that wasn't the intention. It was all about we can be more inclusive, we can provide in the mainstream, but somehow, and I think, yes, those accountability exams, pressures have really, haven't they, had an opposite effect on that. But let's think, yes, we've got a lot of barriers, a lot of things going on. But what might a more effective and more equitable high needs funding system look like?
Right, big question.
Yeah.
So I think, well, you can't really look at funding in isolation. The reform needs to look at the whole ecosystem. We first need to be clear, like everything, with what you want to achieve, and then you need to build a funding model that supports that vision. So the starting point is really to have a clear vision of what inclusion means and clarified expectations. There is no definition in England. There is one internationally that we have ratified, but I think this probably will come out of the white paper. So it doesn't necessarily mean changing the statutory framework, in my view. It perhaps needs clarifying it. And the problems have occurred more around the implementation and the lack of clarity of roles and responsibility. This has led to a huge variability in the identification and threshold. So therefore, after clarifying the vision, I think we need to be clear on the definitions and the expectation of what the mainstream school should provide. So this would really help ensure more equitable triage upstream and be able to reuse strategically the specialist places for really complex needs based on really consistent criteria. Then we need to align expectations with resources. Once you have clarified the expectations, you need to align the resources. You need to build expertise, confidence, and capacity in the workforce, in the schools. You need to really enable the schools to access better support services in a more integrated way. You also need to design, as we mentioned earlier, to design the curriculum and assessment and pedagogy with all the learners in mind. And we shouldn't forget to involve the parents and families in the co-production. But we also need to use the data more proactively on place planning, on one hand, to forecast the demand a bit better and plan the number of specialist places, but also to track the impact. I think even though some people get an ESCP, we are not even holding them accountable on the outcomes, which is very surprising. And we need to perhaps rethink the role of the specialist sector so that we can make better use of their expertise and support mainstream schools via outreach services. This is what happened in Portugal, for example, where they closed special schools and use the expertise from the specialist sector to support mainstream and also adapt the physical and digital infrastructure with the accessibility tools. And there's a lot of work to manage transitions as well between phases. So you lose a lot of children between primary and secondary, and as well moving to adulthood, because otherwise they stay in the high needs block up to 25. But if you support them to find a job, not only is good for them, but it's also financially more sustainable. But to do all this, you need a sufficiency of funding. But it's not just about how much money, it's about how you design a funding model that is supporting of inclusion. So it's not about really funding a problem, it's really funding a fully resourced education system that meets all learners' needs. So in the work I did last year with Dr. Peter Gray and the high needs funding groups we've set up with a number of professional organizations, we designed some funding principles. We had 6 design principles for an efficient high needs funding model. So the first one is about improving outcomes, of course. The second one is provide a relatively stable budget to schools and setting so that they can plan for the longer terms, which means moving away from a reactive system when the pupil fails to a proactive system supporting early intervention. The other design principle is to ensure equity and transparency. Equity when you allocate funds to local authorities, but also to schools and pupils. And the fourth one is around avoiding perverse incentive. The fifth one about unnecessary bureaucracy. And the last one being financially sustainable. So this could mean a three-tier funding model. At the tier one, you would have an increase in the school funding that directly supports the delivery of the universal offer. Without what's important is that without the need for an ESCP for the vast majority of the most moderate needs, moving away from the top-up system to funding the schools. The second tier would be devolving additional funding to schools, to groups of schools or clusters with decisions made collectively that are not dependent on EHCP. And the third tier would be retaining individualized funding for children with severe needs who may require specialist places. So all this is, I'm talking about mainstream for specialist settings and post-16. They are very important funding consideration, but it's another separate issue that may require more time. But this proactive approach would really allow greater budget stability for schools, long-term investment in the workforce rather than relying on unpredictable top-ups. And it doesn't mean cutting the support at all. Sometimes the backbenchers are always trying to criticize any proposal of reform, but it would be a lot more dynamic. You can adapt the funding depending on the evolution of the needs, and proactive, you get it, you can plan, you don't need to label to intervene, and local collaboration is really encouraged. So it's the resources are allocated a lot more dynamically and proactively, cutting back on the paperwork, on the cost of the courts, on the transport as well, because the needs are met closer to home, and which is releasing significant resources to the front line.
Few things to consider there. Thank you so much. And I think it's one of the things I picked up or I remember from the paper which you wrote for ISBOL around SEM provision, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes, was picking up on this actually from international research that when you have an input model, so where funding attached to individual pupils doesn't actually work to build in a more inclusive system. So yes, there is learning, isn't there, that we can do from other settings, other countries, I think, and you mentioned Portugal there. What are the good practices out there that you think we can learn from or adapt things?
So yeah, I always like to look at what's happening elsewhere. But you're right. So there are great examples internationally, but also great examples in England that we need to learn from. The recommendations of the three-tier model I talked about earlier are very much inspired by the research carried out by the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, where they distinguish these two models, as you mentioned, the input model, which is really at individual pupil level, reinforcing the identification of low achievement in order to generate more funds. The research is showing that it leads to less inclusion, more labeling, rising cost, and more segregation in specialist settings, with often costly bureaucratic procedures such as diagnostic, appeals, and those models create disincentives to inclusion. They foster exclusionary strategic behaviors. So school may either feel disempowered to act inclusively or treated inequitably, or sometimes it could place schools that are committed to be inclusive at a disadvantage. Criteria for learning disabilities are vague and subjective, and they change over time, which cause an issue when the funding is linked to the pupil. So the other way to do it, as I described in the previous question, is the throughput model, which is often associated, according to the research, to decentralized approaches that provide greater degree of flexibility at local level. So where the funding is often delegated to regional institutions who decide how the money is spent based on local expertise. So there are really good examples of those more collective approaches in Finland, so in Portugal, but also outside Europe, Singapore, in Europe as well. Netherlands is a good example, but outside Europe, New Zealand, Ontario is often quoted as well in this area. So the European agency conclude that the most effective models, they tend to combine the two input and throughput model, with the throughput for the vast majority of the needs and reserving the input funding for the most severe needs. So for those who would like to know more about international comparison, Loic Menzies and the Excellence Research Team has produced a series of reports on SEND accountability, and you can find them on the Center for Education System website. They are really excellent. They don't impose a model, but they really give you the options to think about. So one promising model in England is the cluster model. We've got 15 local authorities in England using that model, where groups of schools collectively receive high needs funding and make decisions without reliance on EHCP. So the benefits, there are multiple benefits. So the first one is really peer support and challenge. And the schools, they really learn from each other. And this is leading to school SEND improvement and more consistent threshold for accessing additional support. So the second benefit is really it's allowing a much more dynamic and flexible allocation of the resources, as well as given its clusters of 8 to 10 schools that are cross-phase, it's really allowing to support them through phase transition. And often they've got key services geographically aligned to the cluster that are part of an extended team. So this approach is really promoting collective problem solving and leading to less bureaucracy as well and less adversarial relationship. The feedback so far from local authorities that have implemented this is really positive. So I really encourage the government to evaluate those and scale these up.
It's good to hear, isn't it? There are positive steps and things being tried and things that we can work and learn from and adjust. But let's come back to that slightly thorny issue of accountability. I think you've alluded to a few things going on. Obviously, there's Ofsted inspections that are looking for particular things. They're looking at your exam data. How are pupils doing academically? So there is this incentive for schools, isn't there, to then maybe in their admissions, they might be looking for particular kinds of pupils and not wanting other kinds of pupils. I feel like something that made me quite sad is when I see comments from head teachers saying, well, actually, in the end, permanent exclusion is the only way to get the right support for this child. We've really got something wrong there, haven't we? So what maybe could we shift in terms of accountability systems?
Yeah, very, very important topic, and also lots to learn from abroad on this. I think we must transition from a narrow individual focus on accountability to a collaborative system. So historically, accountability has been aligned primarily with what we call the summative function of quality assurance, designed to really hold the key stakeholders to account. So it tends to be really a compliance-driven, top-down inspections. But this reliance on high-stake, externally driven accountability really carries significant risk, which fundamentally undermines the spirit of inclusive education. So high-stake regimes, especially when they are linked to the publication of results, they can incentivize negative practices such as teaching to the test or really manipulate the admissions criteria, for example. So the prioritization of narrow academic criteria can work against the development of inclusive education and really create competition and undermine this collaboration. So currently our system is very much trapped in an individual-centric compliance-driven model through the EHCP as well as these narrow measures we've talked about. So across the globe, we are now seeing a shift away from narrow top-down control. Finland is a great example of a system built on collective system of accountability and professional trust, demonstrating that you can really have high quality inclusive education and high performance without seeing the anxiety we see here around the high stake system. So in England, I think we must shift from an individual compliance to whole school accountability. I think Ofsted is looking at this at the moment. But we also must broaden our metrics beyond exam data. And I think curriculum review could go a bit further than that, include data like belonging, social and emotional development, or well-being. And what is important when we talk about accountability is that we cannot sanction schools or local authorities if you don't give them the means to achieve what is expected of them. So I think we need to bear that in mind. And ultimately, we need to move from a system of gatekeeping, really, to one of capability building, which is a lot more positive in my view.
And I think you're very right, aren't you? At the moment, what we have is a very high stakes system where if your inspection goes wrong, there are consequences. And so you can see why head teachers and leaders are in a tricky position. So it feels like, yes, there's lots of potential for change and steps forward. And yeah, we'll see what plans the government sets in progress in change. But change can be difficult too, can't it? So how do we need to do this in a way that's maximum impact, minimal disruption, and doesn't, isn't too worrying?
Thank you for your question, Lisa. And I think it's a very important one because the previous reform failed on implementation. So it must really be delivered through a very carefully staged long-term strategic framework. And the sequencing in particular is very critical. So the reform is not a linear process, but a very complex, interconnected system, and where you need to prioritize the foundational work before altering the statutory entitlement. So I think I mentioned briefly before, but the immediate priority is to define the clear national vision and values alongside very clear and consistent expectations. And then you need to invest in the workforce and in the infrastructure and in the specialist support to build the capacity within the system before any changes are made to accountability frameworks or to education, health and care plans. So really strengthening the universal offer, which is essential to really restore parental confidence. A reduction in ESCP will really come as a natural outcome of an improved system where parents will feel that the needs are met without necessarily needing a label, rather than having a forced reduction, which is causing a lot of fears at the moment. So I think a period of double funding is really necessary and inevitable to really build the capacity of the new core offer, while at the same time funding the existing system to protect current entitlements. And finally, maximum impact cannot be achieved through a top-down national policy. As central government is really, they often lack longevity and local understanding for such complex transformation. So I think the reform should really embrace decentralized models that really nurture local initiatives and adaptability. The local initiative should really be properly evaluated and sponsored and supported through, for example, communities of practice. You may want to view this like building a new bridge really alongside an old one, and you can't really demolish the old bridge until you have built the new one. And once the new bridge is capable of carrying the load, then you can really start to divert the traffic to the new bridge, if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And yes, and that what you say makes much sense. That actually, yes, let's build the sort of national consistency and coherence in the message and what things mean, combined with the more local approaches, supporting the workforce, you say, and then perhaps people won't necessarily feel the same need for that individual funding. Though of course it does if we are double funding for a while. There's a challenge for our government too, isn't there? And I wonder, Benedict, if there's anything that you've been reading or listening to recently that's particularly helped your thinking in this area or in anything else. Yeah, what's been inspiring you lately?
Right. So yeah, let's talk about something else. So yeah, over Christmas, usually I use that time to catch up on my reading. And yeah, I came across a very interesting subtract by Sam Friedman, who always does very interesting subtracts. This one was about TikTok politics and how it's changing the way people engage with and think about their political choices. So, and he's explaining in that subtract that we've moved from literate to a visual culture, with an addiction to dopamine hits and with a very short attention spans. And that now politicians have like 3 seconds to hook a viewer before they scroll. And in debates, for example, they barely have time to respond on complex issues, which is very frustrating. So this environment is really rewarding emotive messages of a proper debate. So we sometimes see completely unknown candidates, for example, he's hitting some candidates, completely unknown, surging from obscurity, and their popularity was really pushed by algorithm. Sometimes there are also rumors that these algorithms could be potentially manipulated to drive behavior. So I think this is very concerning for the future of democracies, especially when we know that TikTok has become the biggest source of news for 12 to 15 years old. Yeah, so I was quite surprised when I read that. And this form of really attention-grabbing, addictive, unfiltered form of social media really offers a huge potential for organized misinformation. Often, the viewers, it doesn't provide stability either because the viewers they will get distracted by the next trend. And another consequence that he's mentioning as well, this visual culture is really translating in a new way of thinking. So with this overload of information, people are getting worse at information processing and memory retention, as they have less memory retention. They don't read anymore, getting worse at reasoning. I think 40% of British people didn't read a book in the last year, and is even worse in the US. So the best mitigation against this is really through education, literacy, and reasoning. And it's important to teach young people how to spot misinformation. I met CEO of Lifta before Christmas, and they've got amazing resources on that, for example, on how to help young people to learn about this. And I think as educators, we have a huge responsibility in this space.
Yes, and I'm quite interested to see say what happens in Australia, where they have now banned social media for children. And while that might not be an approach that works in the long term, I see it as an interesting move. And maybe, we need a bit less of it for adults too. Yeah. Put our phones down and pick up a book instead. Oh, well, thank you so much, Benedict. You've given an awful lot to think about and take away and process. But I feel like while we have big challenges, we can also see there are definitely ways forward and things we can learn from and things that we can put into practice to create that more fair and equitable system.
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for inviting me. And of course, we have to end by wishing everybody a very happy new year ahead.
Absolutely.
Bonne année.
Yeah.
Thank you.